The Abomination of Terror Creek. For years, the people of Ravenswood had heard whispers of strange happenings at Terror Creek, but they never expected the horror that was to come. It started with reports of missing livestock and pets. Then the townspeople began to go missing. At first they assumed it was just an unfortunate series of events, but as the disappearances continued, they realized that something was amiss. The locals organized search parties to comb the woods surrounding the creek, but they never found anything. It was as if the people had vanished into thin air. One night, a group of hunters decided to investigate the source of the strange occurrences themselves. Armed with rifles and flashlights, they ventured into the woods. They didn't get far before they heard it. A guttural, inhuman growl that made their blood run cold. They shone their lights in the direction of the sound and saw it. The Abomination of Terror Creek. It was a massive, misshapen thing, with too many eyes and too many teeth. It moved with unnatural speed, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The hunters tried to run, but it was too late. The creature pounced, tearing them apart with ease. Word of the creature spread throughout Ravenswood, and the townspeople barricaded themselves in their homes, afraid to venture out after dark. But it wasn't enough. The creature was getting bolder, venturing closer and closer to town. And then one night it struck. It burst into a home in the dead of night, snatching up a small child in its massive jaws. The townspeople knew they had to act. They gathered whatever weapons they could find and marched to Terror Creek, determined to rid themselves of the abomination once and for all. It was a fierce battle, with the creature fighting back with all its might. But eventually, the townspeople emerged victorious. The Abomination of Terror Creek was no more, but the memory of the creature haunted the people of Ravenswood for years to come. They never forgot the horror that had descended upon their town, and they knew that they could never let their guard down again. Despite their victory over the Abomination of Terror Creek, the people of Ravenswood knew that their town was forever changed. The memory of the creature lingered in the minds of the survivors, causing many of them to suffer from nightmares and constant fear. In the aftermath of the battle, the townspeople set up a permanent guard at the edge of the woods, watching for any sign of another abomination. They knew that they could never let their guard down, for the slightest misstep would mean the difference between life and death. As time passed, the town began to heal, but the scars of the creature's attack remained, both in the physical damage to the town and in the emotional trauma suffered by its inhabitants. Despite the ongoing danger, some brave souls continued to explore Terror Creek, searching for answers about what had caused the abomination to appear in the first place. Some believed that it was the result of toxic waste dumped by a nearby factory, while others thought it was a product of a supernatural force. Regardless of the cause, the people of Ravenswood knew that they could never let their guard down again. They worked together to rebuild their town and strengthen their defenses, determined to never let another abomination terrorize their community. And yet in the dark of night, when the wind blows just right, the whispers of the dead can still be heard. They speak of unspeakable horrors, of creatures from beyond the veil, and of a darkness that will soon engulf the land once more. The Drowning Pool. For generations, the people of the small town near Terror Creek had been warned to stay away from the creek at night. It was said that the waters turned black as ink, and that something sinister lurked beneath the surface. But for 16-year-old Jenny, the warnings were nothing more than old wise tales. Jenny had always been fearless, a daredevil who loved to push the limits. So, when her friends dared her to swim across Terror Creek at midnight, she didn't hesitate. She had heard the stories about the creek claiming a life every year, but she didn't believe them. After all, she was a strong swimmer, and she had always been able to handle anything that came her way. That night, Jenny and her friends made their way to the creek, their flashlights illuminating the path ahead. The water was cold, and Jenny's heart pounded in her chest as she dove in. For a few moments, everything seemed fine, but then something strange happened. The water began to churn around her, pulling her down deeper and deeper. Panic set in as Jenny struggled to stay afloat. She could feel something dragging her under, pulling her towards the murky depths. She tried to scream, but the water filled her mouth, choking her. It was only then that she realized that the stories were true. Terror Creek was a pool of death. In that moment, Jenny knew that she was going to die. She could see the faces of her friends, watching helplessly from the shore, but they were too far away to save her. She tried to swim towards them, but the current was too strong. And then everything went dark. The next morning, Jenny's body was found washed up on the shore of Terror Creek. Her friends were devastated. Haunted by the memory of what they had seen, the town was shaken, and the warnings about Terror Creek became even more urgent. But for Jenny, it was too late. She had ignored the warnings, and now she was just another victim of the drowning pool. And as the years went by, more and more people would be claimed by the creek, their bodies never to be seen again. It was a curse, a terrible legacy that would haunt the town for generations to come. Despite the tragedy of Jenny's death, some of the townspeople still refused to believe that there was anything unusual about Terror Creek. They insisted that she must have just gotten caught in a pond or had a cramp, and that the stories of the creek being cursed were just nonsense. But for others, Jenny's death was a wake-up call. They began to take the warnings about the creek more seriously, and many started avoiding it altogether, especially at night. As for Jenny's friends, they were never the same after that fateful night. They were plagued by nightmares of the black waters and the feeling of being pulled under. Some even claimed that they could still hear Jenny's voice whispering to them from the depths of the creek. But the true horror of Terror Creek wasn't just the drownings. As more and more people disappeared, rumors began to circulate that there was something sinister living in the creek. Some said it was a creature from beyond the veil, while others believed it was a malevolent spirit that had been awoken by Jenny's death. Whatever it was, the fear of Terror Creek only grew with each passing year. The townspeople had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as superstition. Now they knew that something was wrong, and as the bodies continued to pile up, they could no longer deny the truth. Terror Creek was a pool of death, and the horror lurking beneath its surface was all too real. The shadow in the woods. The town of Terror Creek had always been surrounded by dense woods, but it wasn't until a group of teenagers went missing that people started to fear the forest. It had started with whispers, rumors of strange shadows moving through the trees, and eerie sounds emanating from deep within the woods. But then, as more and more people vanished, the whispers turned into screams. No one knew what was happening or why people were disappearing. But everyone agreed on one thing: as something was out there, something dark and malevolent that preyed on those who ventured too far into the woods. For years, the forest remained a source of fear and speculation, a place that parents warned their children to stay away from. But then, one day, a group of thriller seekers decided to explore the woods, to see for themselves what lay beyond the tree line. At first, everything seemed fine. They hiked through the woods, laughing and joking, feeling invincible. But then, as the sun began to set, they realized that they had gone too far. They were lost, disoriented, and the woods around them seemed to be alive with the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. That's when they saw it, a dark figure, looming in the shadows. It was humanoid, but its features were twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. It watched them, silent and unmoving, and they knew that they were in grave danger. They tried to run, but the forest seemed to be closing in around them. Trees became twisted and gnawed. Roots tangled around their ankles, and the air became thick and suffocating. They could hear the figure following them, its footsteps echoing through the woods. As they stumbled blindly through the forest, they saw glimpses of other figures, shadows moving through the trees, and they knew that they were not alone. Whatever was out there was closing in, and they were trapped. It was only when they stumbled upon an old cabin deep in the woods that they finally found refuge. They barricaded themselves inside, huddled together in the darkness, waiting for the night to end. In the morning, they emerged from the cabin, shaken but alive. They had escaped the shadow in the woods, but they knew that they had witnessed something beyond their understanding, something ancient and malevolent that lurked in the heart of the forest. And from that day on, the people of Terror Creek avoided the woods at all costs. They knew that the shadow was still out there, waiting in the darkness, and that those who ventured too far into the woods would never be seen again. Despite their terror, some of the townspeople couldn't resist the lure of the mystery that surrounded the shadow in the woods. They began to organize expeditions into the forest, determined to uncover the truth behind the creature's existence. But as each group entered the woods, they were met with the same fate, disappearing without a trace. The shadow in the woods seemed to be growing bolder, more aggressive, and the people of Terror Creek began to fear that it would soon venture beyond the forest and into their town. Rumors began to spread that the shadow was not just a creature, but a manifestation of an ancient curse that had been placed on the town centuries ago. Some believed that the shadow was the physical embodiment of the curse, sent to wreak havoc on the town and its people. Others believed that the shadow was a harbinger of a much larger, more malevolent force that was slowly creeping towards Terror Creek, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the years passed, the shadow in the woods became a legend, a story that parents told their children to keep them from venturing too far from home. But the fear never truly subsided, and the people of Terror Creek knew that they would always be haunted by the memory of the shadow and the terror that it represented. And And even now, in the darkest nights, some say that they can still hear the whispers of the shadow in the woods, beckoning them to explore the forbidden depths of the forest. But those who heed the call do so at their own peril, for the shadow is always waiting, watching, and ready to claim its next victim. The Unholy Ground. The town of Coldwater had always been a quiet and peaceful place, nestled in the foothills of the mountains, but that all changed when a group of developers bought a large plot of land on the outskirts of town with plans to build a new housing development. What the developers didn't realize was that the land they had purchased was an ancient burial ground. Long forgotten by the living, Tara Creek flowed through the heart of the burial ground, carrying with it the restless spirits of the dead. As construction began, strange things started happening. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason, and workers reported feeling a sense of unease that they couldn't explain. Some even claimed to have seen apparitions in the shadows, lurking just beyond the edge of the construction site. The workers tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but the disturbances only grew worse as the days went by. One night, as the workers slept in their trailers, they were wakened by unearthly screams and the sound of digging. When they emerged from their trailers, they saw that the graves had been disturbed and the skeletons of the dead were strewn about. The workers knew that something was terribly wrong. They tried to leave the site, but the spirits of the dead had other plans. The ground beneath their feet seemed to come alive, trapping them in place, and then the skeletons began to move, rising up from their graves and lurching towards the living. But the workers fought back with everything they had. But it was no use. The spirits of the dead were too strong, and soon the workers were overwhelmed. A few who managed to escape fled back to town, spreading the word of the unholy ground and the vengeful spirits that lurked within. The people of Coldwater were skeptical at first, dismissing the stories as the product of an overactive imagination. But as the nights grew longer and the disturbances grew more frequent, they began to realize that something was very wrong. The spirits of the dead were not content to remain in their graves. They rose up every night, seeking revenge on those who had disturbed their rest. The people of Coldwater tried everything to appease the spirits, but it was no use. The spirits were too powerful, too angry, too vengeful. And so the town was drawn into a struggle between the living and the dead. They fought against the spirits with everything they had, using every weapon at their disposal. But the spirits were relentless, and the town began to crumble under the weight of their wrath. In the end, it was only through a desperate sacrifice that the people of Coldwater were able to put the spirits to rest. They offered up their own blood and flesh to the earth, hoping to appease the spirits and put an end to their torment. The unholy ground lay quiet once more, and the people of Coldwater returned to their daily lives. But they knew that they could never forget the horror that they had faced, for the spirits of the dead were always watching, waiting for the next disturbance to awaken them once more. The memory of the unholy ground and the vengeful spirits that haunted it lingered in the minds of the people of Coldwater, and they never forgot the sacrifice that had been made to put the spirits to rest. The once thriving town now stood in ruins, with many of its buildings destroyed and its population greatly reduced. The few remaining residents were haunted by the ghosts of their loved ones and the horrors they had witnessed. But despite the devastation, a few brave souls remained determined to rebuild their town and make amends for the desecration of the burial ground. They worked tirelessly to restore the land, planting trees and flowers as a sign of respect for the dead. The spirits of the dead seemed to have accepted the offerings of the living, and the town slowly began to recover. But the people of Coldwater knew that they could never forget the lessons they had learned, and they remained vigilant, always watching for signs of the spirits' return. And as the years passed, the town of Coldwater became known as a place of great reverence for the dead, a place where the living worked to coexist with the spirits that haunted the land. The unholy ground was a reminder of the past, but it was also a symbol of hope for the future, a promise that the living and the dead could find peace together, in a place where both were respected and honored. The whispers of the dead. In the small town of Ravenswood, nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the locals whispered about Tara Creek. They spoke of strange occurrences, of eerie noises that could be heard in the dead of night. But most of all, they spoke of the whispers of the dead. Legend had it that those who listened carefully could hear the voices of the deceased carried on the breeze that blew from the creek. They spoke of unspeakable horrors, of creatures from beyond the veil, and of a darkness that would soon engulf the land. As a young girl, Sarah had heard the whispers herself. At first, she had thought she was imagining things, but as the whispers grew louder and more frequent, she knew they were real. Her parents had dismissed her claims, saying she was just trying to scare her younger siblings. But Sarah knew the truth. The dead were trying to tell her something. Years passed and Sarah grew up, but the whispers never stopped. In fact, they grew louder and more urgent. She began to spend more and more time at the creek, trying to decipher the messages from beyond the veil. One night, as she sat by the creek, the whispers grew louder than ever before. She could make out words now, words that sent shivers down her spine. Darkness is coming. Something evil is awakening. Run, Sarah, run. But it was too late. Sarah could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, heavy footsteps that seemed to be getting closer and closer. She turned around to face the darkness, but it was already upon her. The last thing she heard was the whisper of the dead, warning her of the horror that was about to engulf the town. And then there was only silence. The next morning, Sarah's family woke up to find her missing. They searched everywhere, but there was no sign of her. The townspeople of Ravenswood organized a search party, but they too came up empty-handed. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the whispers of the dead grew louder and more frequent. The townspeople began to fear that something unspeakable had happened to Sarah, and that the darkness she had warned them about was now upon them. Strange things began to happen in Ravenswood. Crops withered and died, and livestock went missing. There were reports of strange creatures lurking in the woods, creatures that were not of this world. And then one night, a darkness came. It was like nothing the townspeople had ever seen before. It crept in like a thick fog, obscuring everything in its path. The whispers of the dead were drowned out by the howls of the creatures that now roamed freely. A town. As the darkness consumed Ravenswood, the townspeople knew that they had to act fast. They gathered what weapons they could and made a last stand against the darkness. But it was no use. The darkness was too powerful, and the creatures too numerous. The townspeople fell one by one, until only a handful remained. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the darkness lifted. The creatures vanished and the whispers of the dead grew silent. The survivors of Ravenswood looked around in horror at the destruction that had been wrought upon their town. They knew that they could never rebuild what had been lost, and that the whispers of the dead had been all too true. From that day forward, Tara Creek became a place of legend, a warning to those who would listen to the whispers of the dead. And the survivors of Ravenswood, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, left the town forever, never to return.